Hello everyone, welcome especially to our very distinguished guests, one of whom has traveled very far to be here. It's very nice to see all of you. Thank you for joining us. I have a pretty difficult job today of introducing two quite accomplished people. So I don't normally take notes, but I thought I had to take notes because there are so many points to hit. And in fact, as I was thinking of what I should say, I kept thinking of Isaiah Berlin. You know, Isaiah Berlin had that beautiful essay on different kinds of scholars, and he said, some are like hedgehogs. They know one thing very well, and then there are other scholars who are perhaps like foxes. They will not boil the world down to one single approach or one single idea, and that is true of both of our scholars here today. We have Nitasha Kaul. She's a senior lecturer, which is like an associate professor, in politics and international relations at the University of Westminster in London. She is an academic, she's a novelist, she's a poet, an artist, she's a professional economist. Even her PhD, it combines economics and history. She's been exploring multiple topics over 2 decades from very diverse approaches: identity, democracy, political economy, post-colonial and feminist critiques of the modern world. She's been studying both Kashmir and Bhutan. Her books include Imagining Economics Otherwise, Encounters with Identity, Difference. And she has popular fiction such as Future Tense, and a novel that was shortlisted for the Man Asian Literary Prize, Residue. It was the first novel in English by a Kashmiri woman. Kashmir is also one of the great themes of the hour in the world, though we are here to talk about Bhutan. So, Nitasha, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We also have Arnab Ghosh here. Arnab Ghosh is one of our own. He hasn't traveled quite as far to be here.
One floor.
One floor. He's an associate professor of modern Chinese history here. His research and teaching interests are in social and economic history, history of science, history of statecraft, transnational history, and the history of India and China relations. His book is Making It Count: Statistics and Statecraft in the Early People's Republic of China. And it really looks at how the early state in China built the statistical capacity to know China through the numbers. And in a way, I think you have a lot to teach us, because we're also living in the age of numbers, but it's all private corporations that know us rather than the state itself. His other research includes a history of dam and reservoir construction in 20th century China, a history of China and India networks in science. His advanced courses are on different aspects of 20th century Chinese history, Asian environmental history, histories of infrastructure. He also offers courses in modern Chinese history for undergraduates. He's taught about large-scale technological and social engineering projects in post-imperial China. He's trained both in China at Tsinghua and here at Columbia University. I think with that, please let me throw it over to both of you.
Great. Thank you so much. So I think just for our audience here also, just to give you a sense of what we're planning to do. First of all, thank you so much. That was way too generous, at least for me. It was very appropriate for Nitasha, but just way too generous for me. But I think the plan, just so that everyone in the audience knows what we're up to, is that Nitasha will speak for about 20 minutes. Then we'll have a conversation. I basically have a few questions for her, so I'll invite her reflections on those. And then for the final 20 minutes or so, we'll throw it open for general Q&A. So, okay, with that, over to you.
Thank you so much. So, thank you, Hitesh, for the introduction. It is a pleasure to be here, and to get back to some aspect of the world, academic world, and dialogue and exchange of ideas as we used to know it prior to the last 2 years, which have thrown everything up in the air. So, just to link back to the introduction, and for an American audience, Salman, should I be looking here or there, or does it not matter? Okay, right. So, just for an American audience, so we have a different nomenclature for academics in the UK. So I'm a reader, which would be an associate professor, so slightly different than a senior lecturer. And the other thing is that although there is a wide variety of topics that I have worked on over time. I think that for me, and you'll see this when I talk about what I have to say about Bhutan today, that for me there is an underlying commonality in terms of the fact that a lot of the work is driven by looking at how institutionalizations of knowledge trajectories happen across disciplines, and how we come to understand something as being part of one disciplinary questioning, and where that leads us to, and what happens if we start sort of excavating the genealogy of that and say, how did we get here? For instance, how did we come to accept that this body of knowledge that we today recognize as economics, what questions does it answer? And were they always the same questions? So hence the economics and philosophy link. And some of that is also, of course, true for questions that we might ask of geopolitical constructs. And that's what I'm hoping to do today. In Bhutan's case, I think the other, so there's that. And also the role that narratives play. And linking back to that, which is again something that will be at work here. And thirdly, the indigenous political expressions, the empirical indigeneity of political expression, which in Bhutan's case, for instance, if we see the path that it has taken towards democratization, that becomes quite clear. Now, with that preface, so what I will try and summarize here is the work of years and years. And there are papers on it that if your interest should be aroused. And if you want to read further, then there are papers, including most recently in the Journal of Asian Studies, Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History, and International Relations of the Asia Pacific. Those 3 papers, but specifically 2 of them that I will be drawing on today. In between, my title's In Between India and China, Bhutan's International Relations. And as you all know, Bhutan is a small, by the way, I should probably ask, has anyone here been to Bhutan? Okay, all right. We might also speak about that a bit later in the Q&A. So Bhutan is a small country in the eastern Himalayas, and already if I define Bhutan as small, mountainous, in between India and China, then I'm not just telling you where it is on a map, I'm also at the same time tracing a particular account of how we locate Bhutan on the map. So that in-betweenness of Bhutan, the fact that it is in between India and China, in other words, in between a small country between 2 larger powers, tends to be the most exhaustive way and often the sole way in which Bhutan is defined. And in my work, I challenge some of that and interrogate how we came to looking at it like this. Nobody ever says where's Switzerland, and nobody ever says Switzerland is just only this country that is between this country and this country. So this is a very specific way of viewing this particular country. Now, the India-China relations have been marked, as you know, by various kinds of threats. They have often hostility along a long shared border. There has often been a demonstrable ineffectiveness of big power diplomacy in bringing about conciliatory understandings in spite of the increasing volumes of trade between them. And this is something interesting, that the volume of trade and the economic relationship between India and China has changed dramatically over time. But correspondingly, Bhutan's relationship continues to be overwhelmingly with India and not with China. And Bhutan's relationship with China, it has consistently been seen as a threat from the Indian perspective. So Bhutan is mapped as in between in a way that is quite exhaustive but also quite asymmetric, in that the idea is that Bhutan is naturally oriented southwards, that it was always remote, mountainous, isolated, and its only natural relations could ever have been southwards, and I'm going to, the story that I'm telling is that even before the Chinese annexation, the Chinese annexation of Tibet in the middle of the 20th century, even before that part, and even before the 1962 India-China war, even before that, Bhutan's this was not just something that came from it. There was a conscious process of geopolitical fashioning that created and later naturalized the fact that Bhutan is oriented southwards, and it's not just just neutrally in between. I'm arguing for an overarching subaltern geopolitical perspective, where I'm saying that we have to look at how the longer imperial and post-colonial history of this in-betweenness has an effect on both our geopolitical understanding, but also in the knowledge making that is available to us on Bhutan. And by doing this, I'm saying we can look at the indigenous aspects of Bhutan's own foreign policy beyond the friendship with India and threat from China, which are the two main ways in which it gets seen. And therefore that Bhutan is not just a passive placeholder of great power politics, but it has its own dynamics that are important. Bhutan typically is studied via Buddhist religious histories or via anthropology, and in my work I'm trying to trace the link between the interests over time, which are variable, and the economic interests have played an important part, the imaginaries that are, I would argue, constructed and shifting but naturalized, and the kind of the role of retrospective projections, in this case the in-betweenness. Now I think I should also summarize some of the actual detail that I have on this. Bhutan was, I don't know how much historical detail I need to give this audience, but Bhutan was the founder of Bhutan came from Tibet in 1616. Bhutan challenges, it has a monarchy. Now it has a Westminster variant of parliamentary democracy with a constitutional monarchy as of the last just over 10 years. Its monarchy is not a divine right monarchy. It was established in 1907, partly also with British support. It challenges the contrast between monarchy and modernity, and also things like the Huntington dilemma, in that Bhutan has that the reverence for monarchy and has not decreased with the arrival of democracy, and the transition to democracy happened at a time when a referendum on the desirability of democracy would have failed. So democracy was led, the transition was led from the top rather than, and something that was widely feared by large numbers of the people as as an unstable system. It is also a country that has privileged what it calls gross national happiness as opposed to GDP, just GDP, as a criterion of welfare. It's a carbon negative country, a functioning Asian welfare state. It mandates that 60% of the country remain under forest cover in perpetuity, and that any future king has to retire at a certain age, and no confidence motions can be initiated in the monarch, etc. So there are a kind of wide number of things that are important to note here. The asymmetrical thing is important, and the reason I'm questioning it, and in the presence of a historian, of course, I want to go a little bit into the history aspect of it. So, for instance, in 1947, at the Asian Relations Organization conference, Bhutan's representative there defined the country as we're perched high up in the Himalayas. In contrast to this, almost every single work of scholarship in Bhutan talks about it being wedged, sandwiched, nestled, located, etc., landlocked between India and China. And that continues to shift. It's either between, so this is a small country between, it used to be India and Tibet, and then it is the idea that this is between a democratic India and a communist China. So I'm really tracing a longer history in my work of this in-betweenness and saying that this isn't natural. It has been created over time. Bhutan has in fact gone from being seen as north of Cooch Behar, which was a state at the time in the 1760s, 1770s, when James Rennell went exploring, to being seen as south of Tibet when George Bogle went with his mission to Tibet via Bhutan, to in between Assam and Nepal trade routes to Tibet for Bengal from Warren Hastings onward, to in between British India and an impenetrable Tibet in the 19th century at the time of native exploration, to in between India and great game territory of Tibet and beyond from Young Husband onwards at the start of the 20th century, to in between India and Tibet from mid-20th century, to in between India and China from 1950s onwards, and now to in between landlocked between a democratic India and a communist China from 1960 onward. In each, so there isn't even one in-betweenness. Before India and China had unified themselves as countries through their own nationalist struggles, there was this country, and the fact that it continues to be, it got defined as this in-between place was determined by a whole series of economic motives that in the first phase, from the 1770s to the mid 19th century is a phase that is about commercial interests. So And after that, from the mid 19th century to the start of the 20th century, that in-betweenness gets constructed through production interests as tea cultivation gains ground, and Bhutan's southern, what were known as the most fertile regions, Assam Duars and Bengal Duars, end up being coming under British control and taken from Bhutan, to the security interests that play a role up until the second part of the 20th century in the post-colonial period. And what often strikes me is the various rationalizations, but often also the continuities between the imperial and post-colonial periods in how this works. The standard story that I challenge, and I will very briefly summarize here, is that 1772 the British come to know about the existence of Bhutan. And that is because Bhutan and Cooch Behar had a dispute, and the British were forced to intercede, and that's how they got to know of it. In fact, Young Husband explicitly states as much. This is not true. It's simply not empirically true. The British, even though any number of books on Bhutan begin the study from the period 1772. Empirical work, of which I have cited here, and perhaps we can go into greater detail here, shows us that there were a wide variety of other factors, and that the British interest in Tibet was not a consequence of something that they had to do for Bhutan, but actually it preceded that. And the reason for that, of course, is one, the bankruptcies that the company was facing, and their need to push up north, which was explicitly stated in the letters as such. Accounts of, for instance, Rennell already having known of the existence, plus other written letters that say that the British knew that Bhutan existed. So this is a very particular imperial story that is told, which is that we just didn't know Bhutan existed. It's only when the Bhutanese started misbehaving that we got to know that they even exist. So if you think about a whole range of things, and in the writing of this, that I came across that are not directly kind of the focus here, but if you think about the 1766 White Mutiny that the company soldiers were engaged in, this was a very difficult time, and also a time that led to this, and that led to the first treaty that was signed in the 1770s, in 1774, which was a consequence of Bogle's mission, which was then followed by several other missions over the years, in fact quite intensively up until the 1780s, and then by another mission in the second decade of the 19th century, which was led by, again, not a lot of people seem to have remarked on this, the person we know of as Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who's spelled differently, but he was one of the, so this was one of the native-led missions, this mission. So there's that, and then there's the Pemberton Mission in 1837, 1838, and then eventually we get to the mission that everyone knows about, or everyone who knows about Bhutan knows about, which is the 1860s Eden Mission. And so again, in the second phase that I'm talking about, the idea is that Eden was treated badly by the Bhutanese, who humiliated him, and as a result, Britain and Bhutan fought a war in 1864-65, and as a result, the remaining territories were taken from Bhutan. That is manifestly challengeable because even before Eden Mission, there were continuous suggestions that this land is fertile. I mean, not just from Bogle's time about tea cultivation, which was initiated by the 1820s, but also if we get to 1850s. I mean, there's even some reference, and this I would want to actually read further work on. I don't think it exists, or if it exists, I'd like to know of it, of the links between the 1857 situation in India and the Bhutan scenario, because at least in some references I found the idea that the Bhutanese stance towards the mutiny in India played a role in how in the fact that the hostilities escalated between Bhutan and Britain. I found very scant references, but I think this is something that is interesting if we think about the travels of some of the figures in the region at the time. And so in this second phase, what happens, and again, I think that it was interesting and also surprising that nobody had remarked upon texts such as Beden's, which was this, Beden was an ally, an administrator for Eden, who who ends up quite simply stating the rationale for the 1865 treaty, which was a really important treaty, by the way, which treaty said that, that basically we would take this region and we would give them a subsidy, and we wouldn't give them a share of the revenue but a subsidy. It's also, I think, partly what is epistemologically interesting is the certainty creation that's happening. Certainty about mapping geographical frontiers, certainty about establishing accounting relationships between different entities, about what exchange rate should be used for tributes at that time. So there's all of these kind of growing pincers of certainty creation, in which Bhutan comes to be seen as a certain, as this entity which is located in between this particular thing that we desire, or this thing that it is obstructing us from. Sorry to sound a bit vague here, but there's just too much detail, and I only have, I don't know how many more minutes. 5 more minutes. Okay. So
feel free to take longer. Actually, they're here to listen to you talk. So don't feel
no,
constrained.
or maybe you can ask me like questions,
Sure,
and I can
but
then
you shouldn't feel
expand
so
on.
constrained,
Right. So yes, that is always a struggle. Like, how do I get? So anyway, so Biden is actually saying that this land is at least 1.5 lakhs. If we give them 25,000, and if we keep that as an yearly thing at a fixed rate, then we can keep increasing the value of the land. They don't know that the value really will be increasing. We'll get other people from other regions, mostly from people they thought were not, and this kind of also had a role in what became the southern problem. We'll move populations of people who are suited to cultivating to these regions, and do a lot of tea cultivation, and that's what happened. And it kind of shaped not just the it really shaped the geography of that region, but also the inheritance in that region of political allegiances and identities, because then the population of the borders of southern Bhutan as well as of southern Bhutan was then shaped by this moved population. And so you have the ethnic strife that we see in Bhutan especially in its southern regions towards the end of the 20th century has its roots going way back in time. Anyway, so then this subsidy relationship was also useful in terms of ordering political allegiance, and in making sure that there were competing elites who could be drawn upon in case of any problems. And this was also a period of time leading up to between 1865, and I think this is also personally fascinating, but between 1865 and 1907. So the idea officially, of course, is that there was no contact between Bhutan and Britain in that period, like no important people visited. That's obviously not true. I mean, apart from the Young Husband expedition, because there were other explorers and others who did go by. But the person who fought the British in this Anglo-Bhutanese war, his son ends up being the first, Jigme Namgyal in the 19th century, his son, Ugyen Wangchuck, ends up being the first monarch of Bhutan when monarchy is established. And Ugyen Wangchuck and his friend Ugyen Dorji are two significant figures in the Young Husband that assist the British at the time of the Young Husband expedition. There's also like that role of the big change that happens between the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So then we have this treaty that is then revised in 1910. And this 1865 treaty that is revised in 1910. And the 1910 treaty, which was the Treaty of Punakha, continued to many of the provisions, but it did have one significant change, which is that Bhutan, the British agreed not to interfere in the internal affairs of Bhutan, and in return Bhutan agreed to seek the guidance of Britain in the conduct of its external relations. And this treaty was signed on the 8th of January 1910. So it's actually like just weeks after what happens with the Chinese in Lhasa. And so this is like a foundationally important treaty. And in fact, the treaty also increases the subsidy to the sum of 1 lakh. And then when India becomes independent, India redoes this treaty, which now becomes the Indo-Bhutanese Treaty of Friendship, and friendship is this consistent trope. So the treaty with India, the 49 treaty, that treaty has carries over that provision that now it has to seek the advice of guidance of India, and it increases the subsidy, and that treaty stays in force, including through the period when Bhutan it gets, becomes part of the UN, and until 2007, when just prior to the transition to democracy, that itself is an interesting thing that they coincide, just prior to the transition to this democracy, that treaty gets updated to remove that clause, this specific clause about its about the conduct of its external relations. In the third phase, in the phase from up until from early 20th to the middle late 20th century, in that phase where India is the most important actor, and Bhutan continues to have a status anxiety stemming from its encounter with varying imperial powers not just Britain but also India later, and the role of frontier political officers is important, who often end up emulating what had happened in the British era. But one key dynamic in that region is the sourcing of materials from Bhutan versus from Indian states. And through some of the archival work that I look at, I show how there are competing possibilities, and the officers actually talk amongst themselves in their note amongst themselves in their files about, we have to, even if it's more expensive, we have to give this concession to Bhutan, because we have to orient the economy of Bhutan towards Indian economy and link it with India, because that's how it has to happen, even if that means prioritizing Bhutan over other Indian states. And they are also, of course, always noting how Bhutan is, in their words, poor but touchy about its status. They don't up until so the idea that Bhutan was remote, isolated, never had trade links up with anyone is also not true. I don't know if that comes across through so much of what I've been saying, but it simply isn't true that it's remote. It hasn't had any trade links. It hasn't had any in fact it has very important links with the north, and with what later become the Indian regions. Now in the context of the contemporary relations of Bhutan and it's how we see it as a small country, it isn't, I'm arguing, simply bandwagoning with India. Not even, okay, so conventional IR would expect small states simply to either bandwagon, and if they're weak, they'll simply ally themselves with stronger countries, and Bhutan. And even there's other accounts of it, such as shelter theory. But Bhutan is interesting to look at in this context because what Bhutan is doing is charting its own very interesting trajectory. So if before 1958 visit of Nehru to Bhutan, where he goes on the back of a yak traveling for several days, and it's a choreographed visit, which is really important for diplomacy and lays the foundation for the present enduring idea of friendship. So even after, in the immediate aftermath of that visit, Bhutan was non-committal about taking aid, and throughout the decades between then and now, the idea that India and Bhutan have the exact same interests is simply not the case. I mean, Bhutan has threats not just from the north, but also from the south, and in ways that is probably impossible for me to summarize unless, Arunabh asks me some interesting questions. What I'm really saying is that it's not this country that, let me just kind of state the summary of it. It's not just this place that's basically driven by friendship with India, threat from China, and that's it. Its internal dynamics have played a key role, be that like domestic dynamics with the change of governments in say 2013, be that the role of the elite and the National Assembly deliberations in 60s and 70s, be that its own exercise of what was the Driglam Namsha, the policy of cultural homogenization that was conducted in the 80s as a way of consolidating its status. It has been, and in all of its moves, or even not voting along the same lines as India at international fora, being very it has had its own border negotiations with China from 1984 onwards, and there's a kind of history of that. Its stance on Taiwan and on Tibet, which it's very careful of, so it kind of does not explicitly take a stance. So it has its own diplomacy, it has had its own foreign policy. It's that, if we look in detail at how it has chosen to internationalize over time, is driven by more than just, it's going to do whatever India wants it to do, or China is the only threat. and I mean, that's not, I'm not saying that there's anything, I mean, it's not even that I'm saying making a value judgment here about competing ideologies or anything. I'm simply saying the fact that it isn't empirically true that small countries are only puppets of larger powers, or just driven, they don't have any internal dynamics. There are any number of ways in which it's possible to see this relationship that Bhutan has with its bigger neighbors in more complex terms. Border, trade at the borders, for example. Either trade, physical commodity trade, with mountain communities up north, or if we think about the livelihood of migrant workers from the neighboring Indian states who seek their livelihood inside Bhutan. And for example, during the COVID, shutting down of borders, who faced a lot of hardship because Bhutan did not open its borders. It followed a completely different policy towards the pandemic than India and many other countries at the time. So there are all sorts of many complex and multi-dimensional linkages than that this country is simply in between, as well as the fact that in-betweenness has been naturalized over time. Last thing, so I'm interrogating this geopolitical vocabulary that we have got for Bhutan. I'm interrogating where it leads us to, and you can choose to believe me on this or read further, but overwhelmingly what I am questioning is overwhelmingly the dominant strain of scholarship on how Bhutan gets seen, and that the labor of geopolitics in this region is one key part of this. Inter alia, it's also a reflection on the politics of historiography in the region, where the same sources, correct or not, keep getting reproduced. It's also, in some of my work, a critique of Orientalist stereotypes, which are so powerful. There's a lot of work that questions that for other parts of the world, not nearly as much on Bhutan as I found. So I think I'll just stop there. And I'm sorry if I've taken way more time than I should have.
No, that was really fantastic. Thank you. I mean, you've given us so much actually in some ways to mull over, and in some ways to invite sort of follow-up questions with. And in some ways, I'm going to take your invitation to ask you to speak more, but frame it in the following ways. So one of the things that was implicit in your remarks right now, and I think it comes through very clearly in the way in which you frame, in particular, the JAS paper, is the balancing of what are primarily sort of economic interests, or sort of that then in some ways get melded into geopolitics and political concerns. So I was wondering to what extent, and you were beginning to do this towards the end, where you're talking about sort of trying to take Bhutanese concerns on their own terms, trying to recognize their autonomy, their agency, and take them as serious actors in the shaping of not just their own politics, but then international politics as a whole. So in some ways, if you had to, is there a way in which, I'm trying to think of how can we extend the case of Bhutan to make a larger claim about this kind of in-betweenness? And is there other, so if you were to sort of say, think about other cases where a similar kind of analysis, whether historically, and I'll throw out a few examples, and I'd love to hear your reactions to this, historically and in the world today. So can we build sort of a theory then of in-betweenness and a theory of IR, which is again something that was, I think you mentioned briefly, that takes us away from realpolitik, large, state-to-state sort of large states interacting with each other and so on. So historically, I was struck. None of these are at the small scale at which I think Bhutan is, whether demographically, geographically, or even economically. But there is the fascinating case that Peter Perdue has written about in the case of the sort of, this is in the sort of early modern era in the 18th century, as the Russian Empire is expanding eastwards, the Qing Empire is expanding westwards. There are polities that sort of disappear. So there's an in-betweenness that leads to actually disappearance, not survival. Which is one example. This is the Zungaria, or the Zungar kingdom. But more locally, there is also the case of Sikkim, and I wonder where Sikkim fits into a comparison with Bhutan or not in terms of strategies of survival. Sikkim gets incorporated into the Indian Republic in '75. So is that an interesting sort of counterpoint in some ways to understanding or building theories of in-betweenness? And then there is in South Asia itself, I guess, the question of Nepal, which again is similarly sort of stuck historically has the same kind of, I think, framing in some of the literature that I'm aware of, including, I think, the book about Qing imperial visions of South Asia that was written by, why am I blanking on his name? Anyway, I'm totally blanking on his name right now, but this great book that looks at sort of Qing visions of sort of South Asia. So sort of an invitation to sort of ask you, where do you think this kind of theorization, what it might offer to sort of international relations or understandings of international relations more broadly?
Okay. Thank you so much, Arunabh. And in fact, even as you were saying, I just wrote Sikkim and you said Sikkim,
right.
just that. So, at its broadest, if I were to really zoom out, I would say at its broadest, at the level of knowledge making, this is about connecting history and international relations. So, for instance, in IR, we would say, well, this treaty was signed, and that's that, and that brought this political relationship into being. And historians would go into great detail to see what the dynamics were in the making of that relationship. And what I'm trying to do with something actually that I'm not speaking about here, but speaking next week and was speaking 2 weeks ago, is this idea of, for instance, how do we bring these two things together? So if we look at not just the fact that a treaty was signed and that brought this particular relationship into being, but how was this treaty signed? What were the factors that played a role in that the treaty was able to be signed? And it's not inevitable, like there were specific constellations of factors which may or may not have happened in that way. So paying attention to them matters. So this is about really taking something that is a kind of surface photograph of political relations from IR and filling that in, texturing that with historical detail. And also partly because of the way in which knowledge making about small states has functioned, that filling in also then involves finding historiographical inaccuracy. So that's at the broadest. The other level at which I think why the in-betweenness matters, I think that it matters to look at geopolitical relationships not starting exclusively from the positions or the interests of the larger powers alone. And that tends to often happen. So if people are studying Bhutan, and any number of people studying Bhutan are looking at this from Indian, what India would like in the region, or what India fears in the region, or what China wants in the region, or what China fears in the region. And it's the same, and I'm trying to reverse that, which is why I'm referring to this as subaltern. I'm trying to say, okay, let's look at this from the point of view of the small state upwards rather than the big state downwards. So that's one move. The other part about the in-betweenness, I think, is simply to pay attention to the fact that smaller states, like in this case Bhutan, but I don't think only Bhutan, can be either the guarantors of net stability, that all shocks to regional security kind of situations, or all regional security stabilities or shocks to it are not entirely dependent upon the big powers alone. In fact, small states can, and in the case of Bhutan, and if we look at the Doklam episode, the border conflict episode, can be the providers of net stability in that region, and that's something that they're doing, which is just passing under the radar. People are not paying attention to it, so they can do that. Or, as in the case of other parts of the world, and on different definitions of small states, they can also be the attractors of big power conflict. They can actually be the reason why big powers can get into conflict. So therefore, taking them simply as placeholders is not enough. And that if we look at this more broadly, then I think that looking into how, I hesitate to say the word because there's then so much that I'll need footnotes in my footnotes to explain what I mean properly, but even Ukraine, if you just look at the ways in which states that are constructed as how they get to be constructed as in between different kinds of other geographical entities, and what role how that in-betweenness shifts, and how can we, what is the kind of that geographical, geopolitical imaginary, what does that prevent us from doing? How does that automatically structure that a framing that's then hard to question? Bhutan's position is unique. I mean, if we think about the fact that Bhutan, Nepal, and possibly Mongolia are the only 3 countries that are completely that share borders completely with two large powers.
Two countries alone, yeah.
And with two kind of rising power sort of countries, Russia, China, or India, China. So it's so even in the subset of landlocked or land-linked, as the UN would like us to think, countries, these are interesting countries. The other thing that is really important and that you mentioned is the contrast that Bhutan has. So that's something very key that has drawn me to Bhutan, that drew me to Bhutan originally. But it's the contrast with so Bhutan survives into sovereignty in the modern world, into the sovereignty as we know it, compared with Kashmir, with Sikkim, with Nepal, with Tibet. The trajectory of in this region, the political trajectories of all of these entities vary widely. And against that contrast, I mean, I would argue, and I do in the IR paper, that two key things that are important for understanding Bhutan's foreign policy is one, how it has bridged distances, not geographical distances, but also attributional distances, and so that countries that are close to Bhutan aren't necessarily only the ones that are near it. Attributional distances could be in terms of Buddhist ethos, environmental ethos, which is very, very strong in Bhutan. And consciously so, or the idea of a monarchy. So the closeness and nearness are not the same thing, one. And secondly, Nepal has been sort of like this, the North Star for Bhutan as a way of not doing Nepal. Mm-hmm. And I think that has, quite consciously so that if we think about, and I give some examples of this, but if we look at the ways in which the National Assembly looks at the blockades that Nepal is facing, even going back decades, and it's actually saying like, no, we don't want that. We're definitely not doing anything that leads to that. Likewise, in the prior to the transition to democracy, you have the palace massacre in Nepal, you have that whole situation in Nepal, which is a huge domestic instability. And at that same point, Bhutan actually has this very, very strange transition where people aren't sure that they want a fully democratically elected government, and it's almost being forced upon them as a gift from the monarch. And I use the word like specifically, like the gift word is what is used, and it kind of ties in with the political religious vocabulary in that understanding that gifts cannot be returned. So if you're being given a gift, you have to take it. So people are impelled upon to accept this transition, even as they really, really fear about what democracy means. So they're actually thinking democracy is all of these other countries, and democracy will lead us down that path. So I don't know if I'm completely answering your question, but I think I want to say that subaltern analysis is important. Joining history and IR is important. Examining the re-examinations of the Great Game, which I see, from an ideological point of view, if we see the Great Game, I think it's a proto-Cold War. And in that context, looking at the specific ways in which political relationalities are achieved, treaty making is my favorite one that I do not hear, but do. And that looking at the endogenous drivers that play a role with the small states gives us different understandings of the larger situation. Mm-hmm. That's really
that's great. And in some ways, in some ways, I think one of the things I did want to ask you a little bit about, and you suggested part of the answer already, which is sort of methodologically trying to bring sort of a historical sensibility with sort of more IR type model building together, and have each sort of inform the other. But there's the other part that I'd love to hear a little bit more about, which is sort of when you talk about sort of applying this kind of more, you can call it so there's this is the sort of bringing disciplines together. Then there's a subaltern approach that you talked about. How did it play out actually? So this is partly an interesting empirical question. How did it play out when you were doing this research, or have been doing it over the past decade and a half, in terms of sources, in terms of sort of your own actual approach to this? So is it mostly going over sources that already exist and rereading them with a critical eye? Or do you think that there are possibilities of discovering things that we have not looked at, whether as historians or as IR scholars, that actually then are necessary to fulfilling this fundamental shift in perspective?
Yeah, thank you so much. So the question of the sources, I think, is really important. My going into this whole thing, I mean, my work on Bhutan goes back to my first engagements, which is 2006. So it goes back a long time. And initially I went to this as somebody interested in the transition, interested in democratization, interested in how democratization is happening in this particular part of the world, what is driving it, why, what it is accompanied by, what is the political culture like, what does it, what sorts of changes does it bring to the political culture. So that's how I went into it initially. But as I kind of got more into it, I realized that beyond those self-understandings and the things that one could empirically observe, there was this longer history of institutions, and that was important to get at. Like, why does this institution have this role in this society, whether it's the monarchy or the particular way in which the bureaucracy has changed over time, regional, kind of regional distributions of power, and the role that plays in identity. Like if you look at Western Bhutan versus Eastern Bhutan versus Southern Bhutan, how do we get that overall broad understanding, which is politically also quite salient in terms of which region has which kinds of political sympathies, not always neatly overlapping, but it's salient. So so that made me want to go back and that kind of led me to the history part of it, and that led me to the archives. So the more I read, the more I found, why am I just reading all of this stuff that's written, which is reproducing the stuff from the British imperial missions, and how is that different from, and in some ways very explicitly different from, the archives themselves? So it's like these missions, and then the striking factors about how dates are. So it's 1772 to 1910 onwards. So you literally have the British scholars only working on the 1772 to 1910, and Indian historians working on 1910 onwards. And it's very peculiar. Like, as historians, why would you only there are book titles with that bracket, and very selective areas of focus, very selective time periods they're looking at, and nobody is connecting these. And why aren't they connecting this? So this was an organic process of reading more, and then realizing also, of course, that the way in which most people have studied Bhutan mostly is as a periphery of Tibetological scholarship. That, it comes from that kind of anthropology, religion type stuff, but also as whatever the Tibetan sources say about kind of, and seen as sort of like a lesser, less relevant, marginal kind of thing in the Tibetan scholarship. But finding that, looking at something from the Journal of Arms Research in that period, kind of, which is this stuff about the East India Company stuff. So looking at that, looking at the Tibetan sources, looking at the archives of the period, actually brings different things that have been bracketed along different lines. So so for me, the source part is that. It's also been correcting some very glaring historical inaccuracies, asking certain other questions about what we haven't remarked upon and where that might lead us. I mean, one thing that I think would be really cool is if we had access to more sources in the post-colonial period. It really is. I mean, it's sure, just even on the most kind of innocuous sorts of things, accessing the archives and stuff. So so the rereading, so it is rereading. It's rereading with a particular political ethical position of not obviously buying into the Orientalist essentialist stereotypes of these people, asking why this gets reproduced so easily and so often, including in like scholarship way up until now, and in saying what those sources say differently. So what does Charles Bell say in the archives, and how's that different from what Bell says in his book? So it's also asking those kinds of questions, and saying that none of this was inevitable. As with, I think there's a really good paper by someone with Ho, I think David Ho, on like the frontier officers of Qing, basically saying that it's not inevitable. It kind of, you have to look at the factors in context. So I think for the sources, I think that even in the outsider scholarship is what I'm looking at, and not looking at religious scholarship within, from that period. And there is a lot of work on ancient histories of the region, actually prior to 1700s. So I'm really drawing this together from across disciplines and connecting the historical archival work from the archives with the IR stuff. Which is often, again, not really connected. We just take that, there was this treaty clause. But what's the significance of why this treaty clause was there? Right. How was it negotiated? How did it come to be undone? And now that it is undone, does that change things on the ground? How has that actually made a difference? What were the rival interpretations? So, for instance, through much of the 20th century, the Bhutanese say that where we're bound to seek the advice, but we're not bound to be guided by it. So they have a very particular kind of take on this, which is their take, which is from their perspective. Some things consistently surprise me. Indira Gandhi at one point saying, I don't know if you saw that quote, but can you believe that a big country like us has to take it lying down from a small country like Bhutan? So that just gives you an idea of Bhutan as, it's not contrary to what you might think now. It's not this just a thing that tags along with India. It's a country that has actually upset no less figure than Indira Gandhi to come out explicitly to be saying things like that. I do see a change. I think 50s is really interesting. I think there should be a lot more work on a wide variety of work in connection with the Himalayas and that region and Indian Chinese. What's happening in the 50s I think is really really key, and I just have some things that for instance, Nehru in the first few years, I think that Nehruvian attitude changes so dramatically in the later part of the 50s. And that part of that has to do with things like the 58 going into Bhutan, which is like this 3-day journey. It could have been done more easily, but they deliberately did it on the back of the yak because the political officer is like, no, you have to do it this way. We want these pictures. We want them to know that it was really hard and the leader of this big country is coming to you, and that's important. Whereas at the start of the 50s in the archives, this was super surprising to me at least, is Nehru saying, when he held all of the portfolios, defense, BM, whatever, is Nehru saying that, why should we send a doctor? If they want a doctor, ask them to travel to Calcutta and get their eyes examined, which is striking. So when I think about the evolution of Indian diplomacy towards the region, or specifically towards Bhutan, in the 60s onwards, it's so different from early 50s, when they're like, why should we? If he wants spectacles, he should come to Calcutta.
So I'm going to try and sneak in one more question, and then we can open it up. Partly sort of connected to what you just ended with, which is sort of changing perspectives, changing sensitivities on both sides, but especially on the side of the larger country, in this case India. And you've written elsewhere also of sort of in the context of, for instance, that excellent essay you have on Xinjiang and Kashmir, of sort of imperial legacies and the ways in which they play out in states that are no longer imperial, or at least self-proclaimed no longer imperial, republican, and so on. And then you have this wonderful quote that I'm just going to read out very quickly, or a wonderful sentence from your JS paper, which says, contrary to its stated aims and regardless of its moral claims, the imperial imperative is never to develop another state unless there is a strategic need to, right? And I think it's fantastic because I think it really encapsulates sort of imperial logics succinctly. But I wonder to what extent do you see this applicable in the 21st century, given that, putatively at least, we are no longer dealing with empires, right? We can get into also the definitional debates, but in terms of the way in which these nation states project themselves, they're explicitly anti-imperial. But then there is there's this rhetoric, of whether getting someone to come to you for help or offering help, and if you look at something like the Belt and Road Initiative, one of the buzzwords is win-win, right? The rationale is that we are doing this because it's beneficial for us and it's beneficial for you, right? Of course, there's a huge debate now about what is really going on. Is this some kind of neo-imperialism in the works? And there's, I think the academic community is quite divided on this issue. But I was wondering, so what are your reflections on sort of the imperial legacies going into the 21st century, where you have sort of actions and activities that can be seen as imperial, but are then not being labeled as such?
That last part, I think, is where I'd like to start from. That you have things that are imperial, that could be seen as imperial in effect, even if they're not, not being called imperial by name. And I'll just throw two more things into the word cloud here. One, or thought cloud. One's the idea of anti-colonial, because I feel like that really plays a role, and the other is this idea of the West. So in that, just so it isn't like an in conversation. So in the India is to Kashmir as China is to Xinjiang article, I'm asking this question, or really saying that, in spite of the differences between the fact that India is a democracy and China is communist, the relationship between, if we look at the ways in which India's management of its problems, which it sees Kashmir being clearly the biggest one there, has similarities with, in terms of sourcing of surveillance and repression infrastructures or techniques of governmentality, with what China is doing in Xinjiang. What people can study, what they can say online, how much access do they have online, etc. But also saying that there is something that is this anti-Westernism is one way to reference it, but I'm kind of the proper way that or the more proper way for me is to draw attention to what I call the moral wound of colonialism, and I think it's a question of missing norms. That we do have a very strong discourse of shame and humiliation for countries that were unable to resist imperial rule or colonization, but we don't have an equivalent discourse of shame for having been colonizers. And that means that leaders in many kind of formerly colonized parts of the world are able to turn this around on its head and say that they were that they are going to recover that the purity that was lost or the moral injury that was caused because the country was weak enough to not be able to resist, and humiliation or shame or whatever of this kind of external direct or indirect influence. So these leaders use that, and then they portray all sorts of critical domestic voices. They attribute those voices to being anti-national, and then the anti-national, the content of that anti-national is the fact that you're Western backed. So they also hand over the legacy of all human rights to the West, which is manifestly problematic, given that, if we look at the whole entire colonial history and the anti-colonial movement against the colonial rule often of the Western countries. So basically, at the bottom of it is the idea that the exercise of power continues to function with a different set of actors trying to replicate similar sorts of dynamics around not giving up, not negotiating, kind of insisting upon control in the ways in which formerly happened in the imperial period. It is also similar in what I would argue is the fundamental kind of context of an imperial ethos, which is assumed economic rationality and moral superiority. We know what's good for you. You will be edified by your interaction with us, by your association with us, and what we say is economically rational, whether we have your consent for it or not. So the choice between political and economic rights, which historically is the classic kind of imperial colonial. I know you're a historian and you probably hate me for putting these two words together, but right now I'm just talking about an imperial ethos, which is this assumed economic rationality and moral superiority. So that gets used and continues to get used in the context of many non-Western entities today that are not former colonial powers, but act in ways that are reminiscent of an imperial ethos or of colonial occupations. So there's that. But the question about how, so you said so how do we understand BRI or these sorts of things?
Maybe just in the interest of time, maybe just the Bhutan case. Like, do you see any of this then applicable in terms of what's going on in Bhutan, or sort of the kind of history that you're trying to unpack in Bhutan and the transition, the different attitudes that you're trying to trace?
So there is a status anxiety, definitely, driven by its encounter with imperial powers, imperial and imperial post-colonial powers, imperious post-colonial powers at the very least. There is that status anxiety that drives a lot of its actions. But I think as a constructivist, realist constructivist, I would say that the narratives of economic dispossession and the narratives of legitimizing particular political rationalities are equally important. So it's not just the infrastructures, it's also the narratives of affect that enable those infrastructures to be entrenched. And therefore the narrative part for me is, and the narrative and the imaginaries they create is important to interrogate, to say, well, actually this. In the context of Bhutan, if we look at the BBIN, which is the Bhutan, Bangladesh, India, Nepal initiative to increase connectivity and ability to kind of transportation, etc. in that region, Bhutan's the only country that hasn't yet isn't yet fully part of it. So it was ratified. The idea was of all the countries. Now Bangladesh, India, and Nepal have gone ahead as of the last meeting, because Bhutan has its environmental concerns if it allows vehicles, particularly around pollution, etc. So it isn't I think it isn't, at least in the context of sovereign entities, even if smaller states, it's important because they have that ability to kind of have their have their positions as counter to this, as in the BBIN case illustrates. So yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you. Let's open it up and take questions from the floor. If you could just quickly identify yourself and then ask questions.
I did have a question, but I don't want to forget.
Sorry, that's not that's not a hand, I guess. So.
I do have a question.
Oh, you do?
I'll see if you
Please.
No, please go ahead.
okay, so
It would be great if you could also tell me your name.
Yeah, just a brief introduction. Yeah.
my name is Madeline Drexler. I'm a journalist, and I've written a lot about Bhutan, and I have done reporting from there since 2012. And right now, I'm writing a narrative book for the WHO on Bhutan's pandemic response, which has been fairly exemplary. And so one of the things and so over the past 7 months, I've been talking to a lot of people and a lot of officials in Bhutan. And one of the messages I'm getting very strongly is that it became very clear during the pandemic that Bhutan was over-reliant on India, and also very susceptible to transmission of the virus through its southern border. And so it seems that right now there are a lot of initiatives to become more self-sufficient in terms of agriculture, and also just to simply be less import-driven. And also, I mean, as you know, this current government, the DNT party, is pretty progressive, actually. So I just wonder how this fits into your thinking, or how you're looking at the current sort of post-COVID situation in Bhutan, because it seems to me that it's a real turning point.
Yeah. So thank you. That's a great question, and I look forward to your book. The pandemic response, I mean, it's the one thing that I did not print out, but I published something called Small State, Big Example. It's in Critical Security Studies, looking at why and how Bhutan. So for the first 2 years of the pandemic, Bhutan had, throughout all of 2021, life lost, and I think that was also the start of 2021. So the response, as well as the situation of the concerning the pandemic in Bhutan, has been totally different. There has been, the norms have been important, early action has been important, kind of understanding of collective welfare, leadership from the very top. There's this kind of thing called the DESUPs, these people who are part of a trained nationwide task force, that respond to disaster management. So they've played a crucial role in that response, and in managing lockdowns when needed, in essential supplies being provided to people at home, monitoring surveillance of health status, etc. So and interestingly, during the time that India had the oxygen crisis and that horrible tragic situation, Bhutan actually stepped up production in one of its kind of border plants where oxygen offered help, etc. So it's a now. I guess the simplest way in which I could respond to that is to say, yes, absolutely. This has been really, really important in illustrating the vulnerabilities of an economy that is the two main economic drivers of which are hydropower and tourism. And so for, at least on the tourism front, there have been ways of trying to mitigate for that, virtual whatever, create other dynamics, but nonetheless it's been really hard. And with being a state where health and education is free at point of access, and education up until standard 10, so that's like GCSEs being free. So the state has a role in welfare provision that it needs to do, that it has been doing. With that, it has had an additional burden as well as responsibility, and a realization of how to, as you said, how to manage that situation with less need for imports. but at the same time, there's also a human power aspect to it, because a lot of the migrant workers in Bhutan come from India. So this is again a curious thing. So Bhutan is actually, so small states tend to be seen as norm entrepreneurs if they're Western, and focused on regime survival if they're non-Western. Bhutan defies this typology because it's a non-Western state, but actually has a strong kind of norms aspect to it, and has acted as a norm entrepreneur on environment, also on the idea of happiness. So promoting happiness, the International Day of Happiness was their big project. So the trade-offs have become really apparent, as has the need for resilience. What I think would be perhaps most interesting for you is the work that I've been doing in a different aspect of my Bhutan engagement, which is work on Bhutan and ecology. So it's called Bhutan Biodemocracy and Resilience. And so from 2019 onwards, so in 2019 and 2020, I organized conferences in Bhutan with a cross-sectoral deliberation, kind of multi-sectoral deliberation with people from different, walks of life and society. So media people, scientists, farmers, teachers, coming together and talking about these challenges, the challenges of development and how to build resilience. So that was 2019 and 20, and especially the 2020 conference. The reports are all of the deliberations are online, so it's all public access so I think that's really valuable. And by the way, since this is on record, I should definitely thank my my award and my funding that enables the HRC, because that was really important, I feel like, in this context, to create that sort of space for deliberation and to make it public. So the last one was on cross-sectoral effects of the pandemic. So looking precisely at these sorts of challenges and trade-off around how do we deal with the price of chilies, as a very practical example, going up to like 800 rupees a kilo, when chilies are a crucial element of emadatsi, which is like the main staple dish that many people eat. And in some ways, this situation has existed in the past around the effect on organic versus imported food. So that's always been a thing, where the idea is that even the domestic food, which is organic, ought to be prioritized, but it becomes a problem because the imported food is cheap. Going back to the historic link here, just as a matter of interest for everyone in this room, at the time of just prior to the 1910 treaty, one of the very strong ways in which Bell is arguing for why we need this treaty is like Bhutan is capable of feeding an army of 1 million Chinese soldiers. There's so much potential for food growing there. Mm-hmm. We have to not make that possible. This would be really attractive to the Chinese. And here we are, like 100 years down the line, where Bhutan has to import food from India. Mm-hmm. So it's, so small states face all sorts of vulnerabilities and difficulties over time. But in this case, I'm hoping that the thing about I think the advantage about small countries is also the ways in which these deliberations can really matter for policy change. And I'm hoping that would help with these insights from the vulnerabilities, especially during the pandemic, because with a healthcare system that can't cope with the number of cases that other countries can, yet at the same time the need for the answer in one sense is in GNH. It's in looking at ideas of development that aren't about rapid urbanization and such levels of consumption, but that again has to do with social expectations, that adjustment too, which is hard. So it's like it's an overdetermined. It's like a very complex problem, but I feel like there is serious thought and effort being put into thinking like ways out of this challenge that take the kind of especially like food situation seriously, and I think that's important. It's at the core of standard ideas of biodemocracy. I mean, I think anyway, the way I see it is that the political, and that's why I use the term biodemocracy, the political and the ecological are actually really closely connected, and especially more so for a country like Bhutan. So yeah.
Nitesh, would you?
I want to actually, I know our time is short. I have a bunch of questions, but okay, thank you. I'm really taken by something, and I want to get back to the sort of telling the story of Bhutan from the bottom up, right? So I mean, first of all, went back to the 1700s and the context for the British engagement with Bhutan. Of course, at that point, the British Empire, which was still the East India Company, was so disastrous in Bengal. I mean, the humanitarian disaster was so massive that it was even a point of rhetoric in the American Revolution. It was one of the justifications that the American revolutionaries used. So I wonder how that played into Britain's, approach to Bhutan. Parenthetically, I should observe that the last princess of Kuch Bihar lives 1 mile away from here, and her country has completely disappeared physically and politically due to various things. But what I'm most interested in is you talked about the period of consolidation of a national identity in Bhutan. The fact that the kingship is not a divine right kingship, it was initiated with British assistance. So what is it in Bhutanese culture that made sense of it? So when I think of Meiji Japan and its reaction to the West, the entire Tokugawa shogunate period, you have the rise of Confucian ideas, which express themselves in Meiji Japan. China sees itself as the Middle Kingdom. The communist state currently, can really draw on that part of Chinese history. So in terms of indigenous history and culture, how do the Bhutanese understand the institution of a kingship and a uniform, or not uniform, but a single national identity? How do they make sense of it? Are there historical resources on which they draw? Is it contradictory? Does it make sense? Is it an easy sell?
So I think the contrast with Bhutan-Kuch Bihar relations, yes, fascinating. And Kuch Bihar was the state that I was referring to earlier, where Bhutan had had an important presence and influence at the time, and those were the hostilities that were key in that period in the the British kind of involvement. The state, coming back to your question about the state making, so the 1907, I should not give the impression that the British chose two people out of the impression that the British chose two people out of this and said, okay, you get to be the king and you get to be the important person. Not at all. I mean, so Ugyen Wangchuck was, and Ugyen Dorji, the other person, they were both friends. They had known each other a long time. Going back to, if we look at the Sikkim situation in 1880s, I mean, the British had after the 1865 thing, they weren't directly involved with Bhutan because there was this, but they were very much a part of the region, and that meant, like in other parts of the Himalayas, changing cultivation systems or standardizing things. So that presence was there, and the and going back to so these were people that were important for Bhutan, for the Bhutanese anyway. So these would have been the most important leaders there. They weren't just randomly any people who were picked. Being the son of Jigme Namgyal already made this person really important, like the main person who had kind of fought the British. So he was really important. And at the time of the Young Husband expedition, their role was crucial. So, and this is also the time that I think, the time of White, John Claude White, and later, people who were to come. But at the time of White, in the first, the British political officer there, in the first decade of the 20th century, in his time, there was also this conscious desire to do diplomacy differently. I mean, White states as much in so many words that we've just, far too long made them feel not important. We shouldn't be doing this. We should do this better. We should be treating them better. I mean, of course, he has a whole range of other kind of, racial ideas about, problematic racial ideas about why the Bhutanese are better, because they're more like us, they're a bit more white and so on. So there's all that there's a natural affinity. But nonetheless, there is a thinking that is shifting towards doing this differently. And in that, I think the whole Great Game context, the China context, is important. So the other interesting thing about the 1907, the origin of the monarchy in Bhutan, is also that it is certified by a Genja. So which it's this document which has the seal of all of the. So it's actually like a consent provided through the affixing of seals by all the important parts of the country. So so there are seals. So there is this idea of getting something, not just someone who's important in the region, but also having the idea of consent. and everyone kind of, all the people on there, there's some complications to that, but all of the people, essentially important people, sign that, seal that. The other, I think, really, important thing in the Bhutanese context, which didn't exist in the Tibetan context, was the going back into centuries, the division of religious and secular rulers. So the dual system, and whom the British referred to as the Deb Raja and the Dharm Raja. So the Deb Raja would be the Druk Desi from the other parallel vocabulary. So the religious, and even today the king and the kings in the case of Bhutan, because the fourth king abdicated in favor of his son. Apart from the monarchs, the only other significant figure who can wear a yellow scarf, and the color of the scarf signifies rank in Bhutan, is the Je Khenpo, who's the head of the religious head. So there's a clear dual system of religious and temporal, or religious and secular rule, which I think is the distinctive thing. And some of this goes back, I suppose, to the arrival of Ngamang Namgyel, the Shabdrung, from Tibet, because he's coming from Tibet, but this is it's a different context. It's fortified at that point. A sense of identity is created, and then to a large extent also retrospectively projected. It also helps that the Buddhist sect the main Buddhist sect in Bhutan is Drukpa Kagyu, which is not the same, obviously, as the main Tibetan sect. So those sorts of differences matter. So it isn't, it's part of that world, but it's not the same as its neighboring regions. And this dual system is key. And so much so that even when the transition to democracy happened, religion is strictly meant to be kept out of politics. So that I remember at the time of the first elections, there were cases that were referred to the election commission because the candidate had conducted a puja in his worship in his locality, and the idea was you cannot invoke the gods to help you, because the idea being that religion is such a strong influence on people, and that people are so strongly religious overall, that religion has to be kept out of politics. Otherwise, the idea of individual decisions, there are familial aspects that play a role in kinship, but religion would be too big. So the clergy do not even have a vote in Bhutan. The separation is intended to be that strict, that monks cannot vote, nuns cannot vote. It's not something everyone agrees with, including in Bhutan, but that's how it is. So there are these aspects of the story, I think, are important, and that have played a role, as well as conscious policies at different points in time around, say, the Bhutanization of the bureaucracy, or the Driglam Namja, which in one of his interviews the fourth king explains to an Indian reporter, is that it's not an anti-India thing. We're simply doing everything to make sure that Bhutan remains Bhutan. So the experience of the neighboring polities, and especially with their, with losing their either autonomy or independence, plays into that.
Do we have time for one more question, or
yeah, absolutely.
Maybe one final question, if anyone?
I'm going to look with intent at the people who haven't spoken. I'm hoping that someone will say something.
There.
Yeah. If you are even remotely on the cusp of sharing a thought, please do so, because it is not, this is a very specific field, and I always welcome anyone's even reflection. So it doesn't even have to be a question, or how it connects with what you're doing.
I actually just really appreciate this. I didn't know much about Bhutan at all, and I think when I saw the talk, I was like, this is something that I would like to know more about, and your depth of knowledge is very inspiring. And I've learned a lot. I'm going back very enriched on this topic, so thank you.
Tell me your name and what you do.
My name is Prabhu Chavla, and I'm a master's student at the Harvard Divinity School. I'm focusing on religion, ethics, and politics, but my undergrad and my first master's are in international relations and diplomacy and foreign policy.
Okay. Thank you so much, and good luck with your work. And as I said, I feel like it's just so much more different to be able to write something that's 10,000 words long where you can actually make your arguments in detail. So I feel like on the in-betweenness, I didn't get into a whole lot of detail into showing you how and why what I'm saying about the in-betweenness is working. So please feel free, like everything is on my site and other places, it's very easy to find. So so there may be stuff which in a talk is just a statement and it seems like an assertion, but there are things that if you're interested you might find relevant. Specifically this in-betweenness, going back to Arunabh's point earlier, that how is a place located on a map? That's literally the question I'm starting from. It's not just geographical, it's also political and it's historical, and asking those questions and how we come to see this as the relevant way in which we understand that location is about how that in-betweenness is not just a geographical thing. It also then has a whole geopolitical element to it, and it then makes us do certain things or think certain things more easily and stops us from, or at least inhibits us from the asking other things, and that's essentially like at the base, that's my epistemological kind of thing, entry into
For sure.
into this.
And thank you for taking us through that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you so much for a fantastic talk and discussion, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.